So, picking up from our discussion on the Pyrrhonists' predicament and the challenges of establishing a tradition, it's fascinating how some thinkers, particularly the skeptics, leaned into a different kind of disruption, using humor not just as a tool, but as a weapon of philosophical subversion. Let's dive into that. Now, let's talk about Sextus Empiricus. You might expect him to be all about his Pyrrhonian forebears, right? But nope, he's surprisingly quiet about them. Why? Well, think about it. The very idea of a philosophical tradition, with its founding fathers and passed down doctrines, screams dogmatism to the Pyrrhonian. It's like waving a red flag at a bull. For Sextus, emphasizing a lineage would be counterproductive. He wants to stand out, to be the exception, deliberately going against the grain of philosophers those who build grand systems and claim to have found truth. His silence isn't accidental, it's strategic. By refusing to play the game of tradition, he underscores his fundamental disagreement with the entire project of constructive philosophy. It's a subtle but powerful move. This anti-tradition stance gets even more interesting when we look at Sextus' take on the Academy and the Methodists. Take the Academy, even in its skeptical phase. They were big on Plato, constantly referencing him. But Sextus? He draws a hard line. Why? Two reasons likely intertwine. First, he probably saw Plato, at least sometimes, as a classic philosopher someone whose ideas, even if debated, still fit the mold of doctrine building. Second, the act of citing predecessors itself feels suspect to Sextus. So he paints the academics as distinct, almost separate beings from the true Pyrrhonian path. Notice how he handles Arcesilaus. He throws him into the mix after the new academy, making it look like the new academy just followed Plato directly, leaving Arcesilaus looking like a lone wolf, not part of any cozy tradition. It's a neat trick to highlight his qualified approval while maintaining distance. As for the Methodists, they're the odd ones out. They weren't really considered philosophers in the usual sense, so associating with them carried less risk. Plus, Sextus focuses on their practical approach following appearances, downplaying any theoretical baggage. He portrays them almost as the good guys, the least dogmatic bunch, which fits perfectly with his goal of distancing himself from philosophers Alright, let's shift gears to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle isn't exactly the guy you'd picture cracking jokes. He wrote about comedy, sure, but his own output? Not overflowing with laughs. What we do find is pretty interesting. There's wordplay, clever stuff designed to catch your eye. Think about it. Starting with things known to us Arctians sounds like Arctine to begin. Or introducing the function ergon of a human being by asking if humans are lazy argon. Or saying positing a minimal magnitude tulichiston makes the biggest difference to Megista. Even pointing out that non-human being, okanthropos, isn't a name because the category itself has no name. It's witty, engaging, maybe even a little cheeky. But then there's the other side. Critical ridicule. Here Aristotle gets more direct. He makes fun of opponents or flawed ideas. Sometimes it's through puns, like saying it's hard to harmonize Efharmosine data with the soul as harmony, or calling the void kinon vacuous kinon. Other times he goes full-on satirist, especially when discussing those who deny the law of non-contradiction. Imagine his description of what such a person would actually do: walk into a well. It's pure absurdity, and he seems to be having a bit of fun poking holes in their logic. He even mocks earlier thinkers as random speakers eklegontas. This critical humor, especially the ridicule, is where things get really lively. So, why does Aristotle or anyone use this kind of humor in philosophy? It boils down to a key function: highlighting where things can go wrong. It's a way to flag potential pitfalls, to warn people away from slippery slopes. Often this involves making fun of someone else's ideas. Think of it as intellectual judo, using the opponent's own arguments against them, or exposing their weaknesses. Sometimes it's preventative, helping you avoid getting trapped in a seemingly attractive but ultimately flawed theory. Other times it's preparatory, clearing the ground before presenting a better, more robust idea. And notice where this kind of humor thrives. Exactly where there's skepticism about the whole enterprise of philosophy, especially the kind that builds elaborate systems and claims definitive answers. If you doubt on the foundation, poking holes in the superstructure becomes a natural, even necessary activity. It's a way of saying, hold on, maybe this isn't as solid as it looks. Now let's bring in Timon of Phlius, Pyrrho's very own disciple. If Aristotle was the paradigmatic philosopher, Timon is the ultimate anti-philosopher, at least in terms of style. His goal? To champion Pyrrho's path, achieving peace of mind through suspending judgment, but he does it by completely rejecting the methods Aristotle embodies. No complex arguments, no careful consideration of objections, no grand theories. All that from Timon's perspective is just pointless, even harmful. We actually have a line where he laments Aristotle's painful pointlessness. Talk about a burn. And here's the kicker, the exquisite irony. Aristotle himself used to mock random speakers among his predecessors. Timon takes that same concept and applies it to Aristotle, and by extension, almost all philosophers who don't follow Pyrrho. It's like taking the opponent's weapon and turning it back on them, amplified. Timon doesn't just complain about Aristotle, he lays into philosophers broadly. Look at this fragment, preserved by Aristocles and Eusebius. It paints Pyrrho as this free spirit, untouched by the usual pressures, while contrasting him with empty hosts of people, weighed down by sufferings of opinion and pointless laying down of the law. What does this laying down of the law mean? It's got layers. It certainly includes the everyday rules and beliefs society imposes. But crucially, it also targets the philosophers Timon himself. Those who think they've figured out nature's secrets, like Aristotle. The term nomothekes, laying down the law, is loaded. These theories are mere human inventions nomos, not genuine reflections of nature physis. And the result? These thinkers are all empty kufa. It's a scathing indictment of the philosophical project itself, presented as a burden rather than a liberation. And Timon doesn't just make broad strokes, he gets specific, brutally specific. We have fragments from his Siloi lampoons, where he mocks individual philosophers. Diogenes Laertius tells us Timon did this in the form of a parody, specifically a Nicoia, a journey to the underworld. Think Homer's Odyssey, or Plato's Protagoras, where Socrates and Hippocrates stumble upon a house full of sophists, each lost in their own intellectual pursuits. Timon uses this same trope. He's wandering the underworld, encountering dead philosophers, often guided by a figure like Odysseus or Socrates. But unlike Plato's focus on quirky behaviors, Timon dives deep into the philosopher's ideas and intellectual circles. His portraits are sharp, often savage, like biting political cartoons. He's not just showing them doing silly things, he's exposing the flaws in their thinking itself. Let's look at Timon's take on Plato. This single line is pure venom. As Plato made them up, refashioned them, he who knew fabricated wonders. The verb anaplas is key, made up, refashioned. It suggests invention, not discovery. Plato isn't uncovering reality, he's creating it. And what did he create? Fabricated wonders, peplasmena thaumata. What are these wonders? Scholars debate. Maybe the dialogues themselves? Plato's own commentaries on them suggest so. Maybe his ideal states, his myths? Or even the puppets casting shadows in the cave. Thaumata can mean puppet. Could even the forms qualify as fabricated wonders from Timon's viewpoint? The pun on eidos forms and the word for puppet adds another layer. Either way, the message is clear. Plato, and by implication the whole Academy tradition, is just spinning fictions. And get this, the name Plato itself hints at fabrication. Talk about a mic drop. Now for Socrates. Timon's description is a masterpiece of venom packed into 3 short lines. But from them the stonecutter, blatherer on the lawful, turned away, spellbinder of the Greeks, who made them nitpicking arguers, sneerer, rhetoricians, snot, sub-Attic ironist. Whoa, hold on, let's unpack this. Stonecutter, referencing Socrates' family background, low status. Blatherer on the lawful, focusing on his ethics, but using a suffix leshe that implies trivial chatter. Spellbinder sounds impressive, but often meant dangerous influence in Greek literature. Combined with blatherer, it's ominous. Nitpicking arguers, obsessed with minor details, unable to stop. Sneesher, looking down his nose at others, dismissive. Rhetorician's snot, another unique word, combining rhetorical skill with dismissal, like blowing something away. And finally, sub-Attic ironist, undermining conventional wisdom. It's a devastating portrait, hitting personality, method, influence, all wrapped in razor-sharp humor. Hard to top that. But wait, Timon wasn't universally cynical. He wasn't a complete curmudgeon. When he talks about some philosophers, the heat dial turns down. Take Parmenides. Timon calls him high-minded and not full of opinions, positive traits. No jokes here, just respect. Similar neutral tones appear for Zeno and Melissus. Then there's Xenophanes. Timon acknowledges Xenophanes regretted not fully achieving the Pyrrhonian ideal, failing to look both ways. He even criticizes Xenophanes for his own monistic leanings, showing a kind of self-awareness, maybe even a touch of dry humor in his own critique. But it's nowhere near the slashing sarcasm reserved for Plato or Socrates. Another fragment calls Xenophanes partly free from conceit for criticizing Homeric gods, but then points out his own flaw, creating a single god instead. Again, mild self-deprecation, perhaps a hint of amusement, but lacks the full force of Timon's main assault. It shows Timon had standards, even within his skeptical framework. Okay, let's briefly touch on the skeptical academics Arcesilaus and Carneades. Did they use humor? Well, Arcesilaus, reviving Socrates' method, invited people to state opinions and then systematically dismantled them. Cicero doesn't explicitly say he used jokes, but he did revive Socrates' practice of making fun of the sophists. Plato shows Socrates finding it amusing to expose pretenders to wisdom. So, while we lack direct evidence, it's reasonable to assume Arcesilaus might have had his moments of comedic hijinks. Then there's Carneades, the second big name in the skeptical academy. He's famous for his sorites arguments, and he used them for laughs. Imagine his logic: if Poseidon is a god, then major rivers are gods. Okay, fine, but then if rivers are gods, every puddle is a god. If the sun is a god, the day is a god, so any arbitrary time period is a god. If Eros is a god, so is pity, meaning all emotions are gods. If earth is a god, then any stone is a god. Without clear criteria, the fun is endless, and Carneades clearly wants his audience to enjoy the absurdity. This brings us to Sorites' arguments more broadly. The whole point is to show how accepting a seemingly reasonable starting point forces you into absurd conclusions. And let's be honest, absurdity and laughter are often hand in hand. Think about it. Pushing an idea until it bursts at the seams, revealing its inherent silliness that's inherently funny, right? Reductio ad absurdum, the general technique of showing something leads to absurdity, shares this potential. And Sextus Empiricus, our next focus, is dripping with the word absurd atopos. While not every absurdity he points out comes with a punchline, the potential for comedy is definitely there, and often it hits the mark. So how does Sextus wield humor? It comes in several flavors. First, there's outright ridicule or dismissive language aimed squarely at his dogmatist opponents. Think of it as direct insults but phrased academically. Second, there are descriptions of the consequences of holding certain views, rendered in a sardonic, sometimes downright farcical, tone. This includes those Sorites-type arguments we just discussed. Third, there's a kind of exuberance or playfulness in how he develops his arguments, especially when crafting examples to poke holes in opposing theories. This might be more subtle, debatable whether it's strictly humor, but it often has a light touch. Keep in mind, we're dealing with Sextus in the later phase of Pyrrhonism, writing extensively, constantly engaging with and dismantling the dogmatists. This context is key. Let's look at Category 1, direct ridicule. Sextus doesn't mince words. Talking about dogmatists arguing about perception and thought, he says they run on at the mouth, throughlussy. Discussing Stoic arguments, he finds it silly to reject single-premise arguments just because Chrysippus didn't accept them, adding, it's not necessary to trust Chrysippus' utterances like deliverances of the Delphic oracle. Ouch. He mocks Democritus' idea of giant human-shaped images as gods, calling it something Democritus would want to make up for himself, bultai hautoi anaplaton. And when describing dogmatists scrambling to defend their theories against Sextus' objections, he pictures them securing for themselves a little breather, micron anapnon horizontes, as they desperately devise temporary fixes. It's a consistent pattern of down-to-earth dismissal. Category 2 is sardonic or farcical consequences. Here, Sextus describes the logical outcomes of dogmatic views in a way that's clearly meant to be amusing, if not outright ridiculous. Take the idea that gods arose from things beneficial to humans. Sextus says this leads to thinking philosophers, animals, even utensils are gods. And he adds, but this is completely laughable atopos. He also takes aim at the Stoics' claim that only the wise are knowledgeable, putting them in the same boat as skeptics, ignorant about basic stuff like whether Zeno contained the universe. For ambitious system builders like the Stoics, admitting such ignorance is deeply embarrassing. A lighter jab goes to Aristotle. Discussing Aristotle's view of place, Sextus notes that heaven, Oranos, ends up being in itself and in its private ownness, autos on bouti okioteti. It's a wry comment on Aristotle's own theory, possibly even a subtle dig at Plato's forms, which Aristotle often criticized. Now for Category 3, exuberance and playfulness. This is a bit fuzzier. Is it always humor? Maybe debatable. But there's a certain lightness, a wit, in how Sextus sometimes develops his arguments. Consider his argument against defining a human being as a rational mortal animal. He says mortal isn't even an attribute, but something that comes after the human being, because when we're human, we're alive. Is he just being sloppy, or is he playing with the etymology of thanatos die and the ambiguous suffix tas? It's a clever if slightly obscure point. Or think about his scenario involving a lead ball falling mid-air due to infinitely divisible time versus minimal distance. The sheer absurdity of the situation is meant to expose a flaw in the theory. Another example, arguing that a wise person with no impulses towards bad actions isn't truly self-controlled, comparing them to a eunuch about sex or a sick person about food. The incongruity and the implied put-down of the Stoic ideal are pretty funny. And the ship example? Imagine a ship moving, and someone carrying a beam from front to back at the same speed. Relative to the ship, the beam stays in the same place. It's weird, it's counterintuitive, and it's designed to challenge the simple definition of motion as transition of place. That ship example deserves a closer look. It's weird, right? A beam staying put while moving definitely brings a chuckle, but its function is interesting. It's not just about making the theory look silly. Actually, the fact that you need such a bizarre scenario to refute the theory suggests the theory was initially quite plausible. The weirdness highlights both the theory's initial appeal and its eventual vulnerability. There's a kind of comic reversal here. The counterexample is so strange, yet it works. This reminds me of something in modern epistemology, Gettier cases. They were designed to poke holes in the seemingly solid conception of knowledge as justified true belief. Like Sextus' ship, Gettier cases often involve bizarre, outlandish scenarios. Both require real ingenuity to construct, and both use this element of the outre to challenge deeply held intuitions. The humor isn't the main goal, perhaps, but it certainly helps highlight the intellectual tension. One last example of Sextus' playful, humorous side comes from the outlines, specifically in the first mode. He argues that since appearances differ between animals and humans, we can't know which appearance is truer. To really drive home the point, he goes on a rant about how dogs are equal to humans in virtue, reasoning power, self-care, the works. And he explicitly marks this as humor, directed at the demented and self-important dogmatists. The humor here is multi-layered. It targets the dogmatist's arrogance, assuming humans are superior. It plays on the huge cultural gap between the lowly dog and the praise Sextus heaps upon it. And crucially, it uses the dogmatist's own ideas, especially Stoic ones, to build its case. He says the dog uses syllogisms, pursues its nature, and has justice, therefore all virtues, thanks to the Stoic doctrine of unity. It's a brilliant satirical inversion of the dogmatist's worldview. Interestingly, if you compare the outlines of Pyrrhonism with Sextus's longer works like Against the Logicians, you'll find fewer obvious jokes in the outlines. Why? Perhaps because the outlines is well an outline. Sextus himself emphasizes its brevity. He's sticking to the essentials. The longer works allow for more elaboration, more digression, and thus more space for humor to blossom. However, don't mistake this for a lack of underlying attitude. Even in the outlines, the language towards dogmatists is scathing, calling them demented and self-important right up front. That passage about the dog sets a tone that makes you wonder if you should ever take dogmatists seriously again. So, while the delivery might be more clipped in the outlines, the potential for ridicule, the underlying skepticism about constructive philosophy, is definitely there throughout Sextus's writing. So, what's the takeaway? Philosophical humor, especially the critical, ridiculing kind, can be a powerful form of subversion. It's not just about making people laugh, it's about undermining arguments, exposing flaws, and sometimes questioning the very foundations of the philosophical project itself. The skeptics, particularly Timon and Sextus, were masters of this, using humor to attack both specific ideas and the broader enterprise of dogmatism. This isn't unique to ancient philosophy either. In fact, this pattern resonates elsewhere. Think about Nietzsche. Could he be seen as a kind of modern Timon, standing in opposition to Kant, rigorous systematistic thinker? Nietzsche often seems less interested in building grand systems and more focused on critique, disruption, and exposing the weaknesses of established thought. And he uses humor relentlessly. Just look at the opening of Twilight of the Idols, those thumbnail sketches. Seneca as virtue's bullfighter, Kant as Kant-intelligible character. It's strikingly similar to Timon's lampoons in the Siloi. Brief, sharp, critical, and packed with potential unpacking. It shows this tradition of using humor as a tool of philosophical subversion is far from dead. It continues to be a potent, if sometimes overlooked, force in the history of ideas.